Hello and welcome to The Language of Power, a podcast brought to you by the European Policy Centre's Europe in the World programme. Every 2 weeks we bring you insight on the latest geopolitical developments, how they affect Europe, and how Europe can affect them. I'm Paul Taylor, Senior Visiting Fellow at the EPC, and I'll be your host on these deep dives into global and European politics and security. Today, we're going to take a look at Cuba, a Caribbean island nation of about 10 million people, and at least another million who have emigrated, mostly to the United States. After his war in Iran, which we're not yet sure is over, and his kidnapping of Marxist president of Venezuela, US President Donald Trump has put Cuba at the top of his menu, saying he's going to have the country one way or another, whatever that means. This could be the next test of his so-called Monroe doctrine, which seeks to drive strategic rivals out of the Americas by economic pressure or by force. After 66 years of U.S. economic boycott since the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro, Trump has sought to ratchet up pressure on Castro's communist successors by cutting off Venezuelan oil supplies to Havana and blockading most other oil deliveries. At the same time, he said that negotiations are underway with Cuba, without saying with whom or about what the U.S. is negotiating. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is himself the son of Cuban emigres and has a strong personal interest in regime change on the island, 90 miles from Florida, his home state. The humanitarian situation in Cuba is going from bad to worse. There have been prolonged power blackouts as the country's antiquated electricity grid collapses. This has led to deaths in hospitals and left Cubans unable to keep cool or to preserve fresh food in the tropical heat. A fresh wave of emigration the last 2 years has drained the country of many of its young talents. Cuba, which exported doctors and fighters to Latin America and Africa, is facing a worse crisis than after the collapse of the Soviet Union, its patron and supplier, at the start of the 1990s. So where is Cuba headed? What might any deal between the United States and Havana look like? And what can the European Union, which has had relations with Cuba since 1988 and a political dialogue and cooperation agreement since 2016, do about it? Which aspect is more important, the humanitarian situation, human rights, international law, or simply maintaining the best achievable relationship with an unpredictable and irascible US president? Well, joining me to discuss the coming Cuban crisis and what, if anything, the EU should do about it are Herman Portocarero, a prolific writer and former Belgian and EU ambassador to Havana, who maintains close friendships there, and Iana Maisuradze, a policy analyst in the EPC's Europe in the World programme, whose portfolios include transatlantic relations and NATO, as well as the Ukraine, the Southern Caucasus, and her native Georgia. Welcome to both of you. Herman, let me start with you.
Thank you.
Tell us how bad the situation is in Cuba now. What has happened to the economy? How is it impacting people's daily lives? To what extent is this the impact of the US embargo and the recent oil blockade? And how much is it due to other factors, including the way the government manages the economy?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. The situation is really dire. We hear a lot about power cuts and the energy crisis, the food shortages, but what is actually more scary still, as I've seen at my last visit, is the sanitary situation. In many parts of Havana, garbage has not been collected for months, sometimes for years. And that, together with inadequate water supply and lack of medication, has resulted in several bad epidemics running at the same time, including the chikungunya, which is very well known in the Caribbean. The other aspect is that Cuba was proud to be an egalitarian society, but you have the phenomenon that there is a new bourgeoisie in spite of all the misery. The common people suffer a lot from inflation due to bad monetary policies. But if you have hard currency, you can find most things. But the constant inflation caused by the weakening of the Cuban peso toward the dollar and the euro makes the already very vulnerable people with low incomes more vulnerable. So all in all, it's a bad situation. Now, to what extent is it due to the US embargo? that has to be approached with a lot more nuances than many people usually believe. You cannot exclude mismanagement of the economy by the Cubans themselves, and I would say especially in agriculture. This is a tropical island with fertile soil and a lot of land that for long years now has been importing 80% of the food it consumes. And the EU and Brazil as well, we have tried very hard to do something about that, but we failed. We always ran into a wall of ideology and dogma about agricultural reform. The truth is that Cuba has failed the transition from the sugarcane economy to food production. The US embargo has always complicated life in many aspects, but it was never absolute. There were enormous amounts of dollars coming in from Miami, the remittances, probably around $3 to $5 billion a year for all the years I worked there. It was possible to obtain humanitarian exemptions to the embargo by doing some relatively simple paperwork, and I've done that for the import of certain medicines. And last but not least, it is generally not known that a lot of the foodstuffs consumed in Cuba come from the United States, because the trade embargo is mostly based on a federal basis, but at the state level, exceptions are possible. And for instance, a lot of practically all the chicken that's consumed in Cuba comes from the state of Georgia. So a mixed picture.
Interesting. So what do you think President Trump's objective is in Cuba? And do you have any idea of what's being negotiated, by whom, with whom? Is it imaginable that Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel could be replaced within the system and some compromise found with Washington, or is there any alternative regime?
The first question is to know if Trump himself knows what he really wants. He's a man of moods and mood swings more than of clear-cut ideas. We see that every day again. I think it's going to be very difficult for anyone who wants to run the country after more than 60 years with the given administration and the mentality of the people that is not going to change overnight. My best guess is that the only structured power in the country, the armed forces controlling the economy already as it is, might be the power behind the throne, that some cosmetic changes might be done to remove the Communist Party formally from power. But I have to say, after many contacts with the dissidents, and that was part of my brief, of course, when I was working there, both for Belgium and for the European Union, that I've never seen the political talent or the know-how with any of the better-known dissidents to run the country or to organize the transition. The point is also, let's not forget, I lived in Cuba when Fidel was still there, and whatever Fidel did wrong, he didn't know anything about the economy. Even his admirers begin to admit that. But he had a tactical intelligence, and he allowed the country to overcome many hurdles. But the successors didn't have that talent. No way. So even if they are negotiating and whatever is on the table, I don't think they have the tactical insights to come out with the best possible results for them. So I think it's going to be, if a transition at all, it's going to be a difficult one, because the country is what it is. Most Cubans have only known this system, and the ones that couldn't live with it, didn't want to live with it, have long left. So good luck.
Are there business opportunities maybe that Trump could claim as a victory?
Well, I think one of the things that is being discussed is to open up the real estate market, which has been freed a couple of years ago, to investment from Miami. Now, that would be saving a market that has completely collapsed because of the emigration. If you know Havana, one of the main thoroughfares is Linea, where you can buy a mansion with everything in it for $20,000 to $30,000 now, which is an absolute shame. So an influx of capital, if the real estate market is opened to people from Florida, might be a blessing, and a blessing in disguise, because it could also do a lot of harm in terms of bad taste and affecting the rich agricultural legacy, which is sometimes in poor shape, but still. So I don't know. For an investment under the present legislation has never been a success. I was very good friends with Marmierka, the previous Minister of Foreign Trade. His big project was the Freeport and the zone of Mariel. where they were trying to attract foreign investment, but by and large that failed.
So what do you think that Europe can do in this crisis? Should it be calling out the US for violating international law with its energy blockade of the island? Is there a political or humanitarian and economic role for the EU? Is a European third way between Cuban communism and US imperialism possible?
Well, we've been preaching that for all the time I worked there. And one of the, let's say, the more insidious arguments I use, well, you say that you have realized all the collective human rights. Maybe you can graduate now to grant the more individual ones, things like that. But it never really worked. And whenever I had to make a speech like that, they sent me to the university and said, Ambassador, this is very interesting, but it's academic speculation, right? So Europe, divided as it is, was very disappointing in the way it reacted to the Maduro situation. For instance, it would have been easy to say, like people, the government of Spain said, well, we did not approve of Maduro, but this is not the way to handle it. But the EU was not even able to do that. I found it very disappointing. On the other hand, as you say, there is a framework agreement that we negotiated long and arduously with our Cuban counterparts in 2016. It's in place, but it's been largely a piece of paper so far. What achievements? I would name 2 European achievements. We helped a lot with the restoration of old Havana, and there is one of the buildings that I'm especially proud of is the Palacio del Segundo Cabo, that it was my project together with the late and lamented Eusebio Leal, and a discrete victory for the EU. We were instrumental with very discreet diplomacy in Cuba imposing a moratorium on the death penalty, because we argued very quietly that it would give them a moral stand against the United States, where so many executions still take place. And that worked out. So there is an indefinite moratorium on the death penalty, which is one of the small but important and discreet victories of EU diplomacy.
Interesting. Well, there isn't a single European view of Cuba, as you said, divided as we are. People look at it differently depending on whether their politics lean left or right, and to an extent whether they're from Southern and Western Europe or from Central and Eastern Europe. With collective memories of communist rule. And perhaps also there's an intergenerational thing. And my generation, which thought of Cuba as sort of a revolutionary, independent nation standing up to a dominant superpower, looks at it perhaps differently from people born more recently. Well, Iana, you were born more recently than me. You probably take a different view of Cuba, in part because you were born in post-Soviet Georgia, and also because you see it as part of the wider transatlantic relationship. How does it look to you?
Thank you, Paul, for having me here. And thank you, Herman, for your insights and analysis. Very interesting to hear you as well. The Europeans look at Cuba often depends on political orientation, but also on historical experience. In Southern and Western Europe, Cuba is often seen more through the lens of sovereignty, anti-sanctions policy, Latin American engagement. While in Central and Eastern Europe, there is often a different instinct and empathy, because people remember communist rule, they remember economic shortages, blackouts, repression, feeling of living in a system that no longer works. Coming from Georgia and from a post-Soviet context, I can understand why many Cubans feel that the current situation is unsustainable. When people are facing grocery rationing, shortages of medical supplies, repeated blackouts, hospitals struggling to cope, it is natural to ask whether the current system can survive much longer. Cuba today is anything but Libre in that sense, and many Cubans understandably want decisive change. There are people in Cuba who may look to the United States and hope that Washington will somehow force a solution, but the Cuban case, and that is exactly how Cuban case is different from discussions around Iran, Greenland, or Venezuela, because the desire for change is much more deeply rooted in the Cuban population itself. So that is something to take into account, although I'm not advocating intervention, which is against the international law from any party or any country. Many Cubans know that if the country is to survive economically and socially, some kind of transformation is unavoidable. That being said, wanting a change and knowing what comes after are two different things. As Herman said, the alternatives are not very clear. One of the biggest challenges is that there is no obvious alternative political leadership. There is no clear opposition figure with a national vision and no ready-made roadmap for a post-communist or post-regime Cuba. And as you rightly mentioned, Herman, transitional period could be extremely difficult. It would require local leadership, strong institutions, and the ability to govern democratically in a country that has very little experience with political pluralism. And that is even harder nowadays with current international environment, with democracy and liberal international world order under significant pressure globally. The system of checks and balances is weaker than it used to be. It doesn't really balance anymore. Transitions are often much messier than people expect. So whatever regime change might look like in Cuba, the aftermath could be even more consequential than the change itself. And that is why I still think that the EU's approach of critical engagement makes more sense than either isolation or intervention.
So in this situation where we are now, thank you for that, what should the EU be doing? What does critical engagement mean in the current crisis in Cuba? Should it look the other way while the US blockades the island? Should it support regime change? You explained the reasons why that could be very messy. Can it do any more to offer more assistance and make it more conditional on reforms, or is that to a dead end?
Cuba today, the EU should avoid falling into a simplistic binary options between supporting the Cuban government and supporting the US-style pressure. And I'm sure Herman will add more into that. The reality is that Cuba is facing a severe humanitarian economic crisis. So the EU should pursue this critical engagement, which means that keep talking to the Cuban government, keep the humanitarian channels open, support Cuban civil society directly, and make deeper economic cooperation conditional on gradual reforms. That sounds like a long list, but that is probably the most realistic and most European approach: to oppose the embargo, to reject the repression, avoid the regime change politics, and focus on helping Cuban people while encouraging long-term change. And let me break this down a bit. Humanitarian aid. The first thing that the EU should do is to increase the support. The Commission itself said on 1st of April that worsening humanitarian conditions linked to the energy crisis required another 2 million euros in aid on top of earlier regional support. That means more food assistance, medicines, support for hospitals, water systems, electricity infrastructure, and emergency relief. Humanitarian aid cannot be conditional. If people need medicine or electricity, Europe should help regardless of politics. Looking the other way is not really an option if the EU wants to present itself as a defender of multilateralism and international law. Where the EU should be careful is on the regime change. There is no guarantee for an alternative being the best scenario either. Of course, the EU wants a change in Cuba, but the EU neither has the capacity nor the political will to impose change from the outside. That is why the real question today is whether the EU values and interests are best advanced through principled engagement or through isolation and disengagement. And so far it has been in favor of engagement because we do have the political dialogue on cooperation and agreement. And it allows Europe to maintain channels of communication and raise humanitarian, human rights concerns, support civil society, and encourage gradual reforms while also protecting its own strategic interests in the region. Although the European Parliament called for the suspension of the PDCA in response to the deterioration of human rights in Cuba. I mean, suspending is not going to change the situation on the ground, right? It is also worth noting that Cuba has abstained in the UN votes on Russia's aggression against Ukraine. That does not make Havana a pro-European actor either, but it does show that Cuba is not entirely locked into the Russian position. So this gives the EU some diplomatic space to engage and potentially encourage a more balanced stance. But that is also something that cannot be the guarantee of anything at the same time. EU increasingly wants to present itself as strategically autonomous, as a geopolitical actor, so it cannot look away, and at the same time it cannot blindly follow the US either. So I will move a bit towards the transatlantic prism on this matter. It will already be difficult enough for the EU to speak with one voice because, as you said, member states have different historical experience, they have different threat perceptions, views on the United States. But at the same time, following Washington would be hard in the current political climate, especially given the recent US rhetoric and claims regarding Greenland. That has reinforced European concerns about overdependence on the United States and the importance of maintaining an independent foreign policy. So in that sense, simply aligning with Washington on Cuba would not sit easily either.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think outside the box. What if the European Union were to say, we will send an oil delivery to Cuba?
But we're not... The energy situation of the EU is not all that brilliant, and it's pretty unpredictable right now. I don't know how much we can spare. I think in the longer run, what the EU could and should try is to bring Cuba again on board for actions by the European Investment Bank. Because one of the long-term consequences of the embargo has been to make it extremely difficult for Cuba to get international credit. They're not part of the World Bank, they're not part of the IMF, they're not part of the Caribbean Development Bank. So the European Investment Bank we tried to bring them on board. It didn't work out at that time. But there's also the fact that many private European banks are afraid to do business with Cuba or to give credit, mostly because of the Helms-Burton legislation, which might possibly sanction European economic operators that come to Cuba, although in practice it has not happened that many times. I think the European Investment Bank would be an option because Cuba desperately needs affordable credit, especially to work on the infrastructure. That's a basic. You cannot go on with an electricity grid and power plants that date back to the 1950s. Of course, all this neglect, I have to say, comes also somewhat on the debit side of the Cuban government, because while all these infrastructures were deteriorating, Cuba spent enormous human and material means on overseas interventions, which, put them on the world map, but it also came at the expense of the well-being of their own population.
A question to both of you. Is Cuba just a subordinate problem to more important issues for the Europeans? Should we effectively have to accept the Monroe doctrine and leave the United States to deal with Cuba as President Trump wishes, since we need his goodwill or at least some cooperation on issues that are more vital to our interests? Is that the problem, that basically we have bigger fish to fry with America than we do with Havana? Herman?
Well, it's always said that when it comes to Cuba, Europe has history and the US has geography. And it's the geography that's the determining factor. You are 90 miles away from Key West. On the other hand, how important Cuba is depends where you are in Europe. If you are in France, where you live, it's just the fact that you want to be against US imperialism. Whether you're on the left or on the right in France, it's always a good theme, because ce sont les chiens d'Américains qui sont responsables de tout. As my French colleague would say in so many words.
Yeah.
If you are in Spain, it's also a bit of a domestic issue, because when the left is in power, as it is presently, it stands with Cuba, and then after the next election, it may be the center right or the right. And then they say, well, you Spanish socialists, you stood with against the dictatorship in your own country, but you stand with the dictatorship overseas. So it depends where you are in Europe. Obviously, we hope that with what I call Orban exit last Sunday, that hopefully the political change in Europe may make it a little easier to speak with one voice, especially on issues like Cuba. But again, we have to see how that plays out.
Iana, do we have bigger fish to fry with Washington than getting in Trump's bad books over Cuba?
Yeah, I like how you call the genre doctrine, and just wanted to comment on that because Stefan Walt's recent piece in the Foreign Affairs says that the grand strategy of the second presidential term is perhaps best described as predatory hegemony. So I found that also a very interesting term to use also in context of our podcast. But in response to your question, I don't think Cuba is simply a subordinate issue that Europe should outsource to Washington. If Europe wants to be taken seriously as a geopolitical and strategically autonomous actor, it cannot say that international law, sovereignty, and multilateralism matter in Eastern Europe, but not in Latin America. EU cannot defend the sovereignty of Ukraine and Greenland while remaining silent when it comes to US talks about spheres of influence. That would undermine EU's credibility, to say the least. At the same time, this does not mean that Europe should pick the fight directly with Washington over Cuba. Realistically, the EU still needs cooperation from the United States on far more vital interests. And the way EU works is that it follows its interests and values and tries to balance them out. So these interests are now Ukraine, NATO, sanctions on Russia, tech and trade, and China. So Europe will probably not escalate Cuba into a major transatlantic confrontation. But there is a difference between avoiding confrontation and abandoning your position. So with Cuba, without turning Cuba into a central issue in US and EU relations, EU will support its position. Which is showing that it is willing to take a different line from Washington on Cuba, including repeatedly voting against the embargo at the UN and defending European operations against Helms-Burton measures. But in practice, Cuba will remain a secondary issue for European bureaucrats compared to Ukraine or NATO. It can continue to defend its own approach with humanitarian support, opposition to the embargo, pressure for reforms, and rejection of externally imposed regime change. But that is probably the balance Europe will try to strike, not making Cuba a priority, but not giving the US a carte blanche either.
Well, one of the things that was on my mind, especially when I became EU ambassador to Cuba, Cuba will have to make vital concessions, whatever they are, to the United States and not to Europe, because geographically and geopolitically, they are just too close. So Europe does not have a lot of trump cards up their sleeve to force or to convince Cubans to do whatever. In the long run, the major changes will probably have to come as concessions to the US rather than to the European Union. That's a sad reality, but I became very well aware of that. So I didn't preach too much about politics when I was EU ambassador because I knew I was losing my time with that. What we tried very hard, together with Brazil at some point in time, was to make deep changes in the economy to make the island more self-sufficient. And that would have been, in the end, a political gain too. But even there, we ran into a wall of ideology and dogma.
Well, thanks to both of you. Very interesting discussion. It's all we'd have time for this week, but you can read more on Europe's role in the world on our website, www.epc.eu. The Language of Power will be back in 2 weeks' time when we'll be looking at France's proposed forward nuclear deterrence and how European partners are responding. Until then, thanks to my colleague Simona Luswadi for helping to organize and record this podcast, and thanks to you for listening in.